Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and this is Redlines. My guest today is Ahmed Kaballo. He's a journalist, a correspondent for Press TV, and a friend of the Grayzone we had the chance to get to know in Venezuela when our time there overlapped in 2019. Ahmed, welcome to Redlines.
Thank you for having me. Great to speak to you.
Today we're going to discuss your work in Sudan, which announced its intentions to normalize relations with Israel last month, October. You recently traveled to Sudan and interviewed the country's information minister, Faisal Mohammed Saleh. What did he tell you about the way in which the United States pressured Sudan to make that change in its foreign policy?
Well, he gave a amazingly frank interview and explained exactly why they had normalized relations with Israel, or decided to normalize relations with Israel. And he said it dates back to when the transitional government, civilian part of the transitional government, came into power, and began negotiating with the United States to have the state sponsor of terror designation lifted. Now, the United States was even back then trying to push for normalization, but the transitional government said, no, this isn't within our mandate. We are a transitional government. Any decision to normalize relations with Israel should be taken by a democratically elected government, not by a transitional one. And they also stated that Israel was not part of the reason why Sudan was added to the state sponsor of terror list. Therefore, it shouldn't be a condition for Sudan to be lifted from the state sponsor of terror list. And the United States kind of played along. But in the month leading up to the US elections, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Sudan and made it clear in no uncertain terms that if Sudan wanted to be lifted from the state sponsor of terror and therefore invite foreign investment into the country, it needed to normalize relations with Israel. Now, the transitional government kind of assessed the situation and they thought, listen, the economy won't last another 7 months. Economic experts were saying the economy was flatlining. Inflation was at 220%. External debt, 60 billion, 1.8 billion owed to the IMF. It was in a dire situation. Queues for petrol, for bread were growing by the day. And so what they assessed was they could hedge their bets on a Joe Biden administration and hope that a Joe Biden administration would not make normalizing relations with Israel a condition. But then they thought by the time that the Joe Biden administration comes into power, which would be after January, and by the time they sent like a fact-finding mission to the Sudan, all that time it would be too late for Sudan's economy and it would be in irreversible damage. So they decided to accept Washington's terms and conditions and just put in one condition that it has to be something that has to be approved by the Legislative Council, something that still hasn't happened.
He did give a very honest interview with you, and I recommend people watch that on the Press TV website. How do you think the average Sudanese person views this decision to normalize relations with Israel?
That's an interesting question because there seems to be, from my experience traveling around, obviously I couldn't do a huge sample, but there seems to be a generational gap. The older generation, those that were influenced by Abdel Nasser in Egypt and pan-Arab nationalism, seems to be firmly against normalization. But the young Sudanese, particularly the young Sudanese born and raised in Sudan, they want anything that will get the economy up and going. They don't like the Israeli regime. They don't like the crimes against the Palestinians, but they think if normalizing relations with Israel will bring foreign investment, will improve the economic situation, then that's a price they're willing to pay. It surprised me, to be honest. I wasn't expecting that to be the response of so many of the young people, but that is what I found.
And that is, of course, the goal of the economic pressure the United States has waged against Sudan for 30 years at this point. How has the United States targeted Sudan with forms of hybrid warfare over the decades? Specifically, what have the impact been of economic sanctions on the country?
The situation, the economic sanctions, has actually just made Omar al-Bashir's regime stronger. As we know from visiting Latin American countries, the sanctions affect the people on the ground more so than they do the government. If anything, it in many cases makes the governments of those countries a lot stronger because they're the ones that have the limited access to foreign goods. And it all started when the Bashir regime invited Osama bin Laden to Sudan in the early 90s, and that began this kind of hostile relationship with the West. But once the 2011, following 2003, when Saddam Hussein fell, Sudan tried to push for better relations with the United States and tried various different methods. And particularly once Gaddafi went in 2011, they escalated their efforts in better relations with the United States. They paid many lobbyists in the United States to improve their relationships. The lobbyists in Washington took their money and provided no results. But in 2015, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were able to provide them with a better relationship with the US, as long as Sudan provided foot soldiers in the Saudi-led war on Yemen. But once the Saudi-led war on Yemen began, they also distanced themselves from the Islamic Republic, a country that they had good relations with from 89 when Bashir took power.
And what exactly is the root of U.S. interests in Sudan? Is it about the wider region? I know something else you discussed with the information minister is the influence of Gulf, specifically Saudi and UAE in Sudan.
Sudan is strategically a very important place. It's placed on the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden. It's part of the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. It's seen as the gateway between the Arab and African worlds. And because of that, it's very important. It also is an important route for migrants trying to escape Europe. So it's seen as an important place. And as I mentioned, Djibouti and Sudan had seen to be Iran's foothold in the region until they separated relations in 2014, 2015. So part of the US's interest is countering Iranian influence, and that's also part of why Saudi Arabia and the UAE are interested in what's going on in Sudan. They want to make sure that the Iranian influence in the Horn of Africa is belittled and it's not as influential. But also there seems to be a kind of battleground between the Muslim Brotherhood states and the Saudi UAE bloc. Now, what could be described as the revolution could also be described as a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood regime. So Bashir and Ghosh, the intelligence officer, the head of the intelligence agency, were very much aligned to Qatar and Turkey, and those that have replaced them in the military council, Hemeti and Burhan, are very much the Saudi UAE men, and they're the ones that were leading the forces, the Rapid Support Forces, which is the biggest militia in Sudan, and the Sudanese armed forces in Yemen.
And remind people what exactly happened in Sudan last year when former President Omar al-Bashir's 30-year rule came to an end. What led to that change?
So it started off as an economic protest against the price of inflation, against the price of bread. The government had stripped away subsidies for food and for fuel and medicine, and it made the conditions for everyday citizens very difficult. So people took to the streets to protest, and the protest didn't seem to be going away. These protests happen every couple of years, but these ones seem larger. It started off in Attabara in the north of Sudan, but then it made its way down to Khartoum, eventually leading to the military or aspects of the military asking Omar al-Bashir to step down. But the problem is they tried to replace him with another military figure, Awad ibn Auf. There was more protest. He stepped down, and then he was replaced by Burhan. There was more protest, but this time there would not be a stepping down. In fact, the military ordered forces to attack protesters on the June the 3rd of 2019, which is described as the Sudan massacre, in which at least 120 people were killed, over 700 injured, over 70 men and women are reported to be raped, when the number is actually probably much higher because of the social stigma regarding sexual assaults in Sudan. And that is basically the crux of the problem. Sudan was forced to share power with the military rather than take control of the government in a civilian control of the whole government, in which the reason why the people started protesting in the first place.
So that leads me to my next question, which is, has the government structure changed at all since Bashir's removal? And based on your travels in the country, has life for the average person changed in Sudan since the government fell?
I'll start with the latter question and move to the first one. So there's been some changes. Some of the draconian laws that disproportionately affected women have changed. Women don't get flogged in the street no more. There's not the religious police policing what women wear and or who they go out with, etc., etc. But in terms of the economy, in many ways, it's got worse. The queues for bread, the queues for fuel have got longer. The military is still an ever-present part of Sudanese society. They're on every street corner. There's still checkpoints that people have to go through, and people ask where they're going, who they're meeting up with. So in terms of that, not much has changed. And like I said, the military seems to be still running the show. Soon after the Omar Bashir fell, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates pledged $3 billion worth of support to the failing Sudanese economy. Now, there were protests at the time because they didn't want Saudi and Emirati influence in their country, and that influence hasn't gotten away. And one of the first things that Hemeti, who is the leader of the Rapid Support Forces known as the Janjaweed, did was pledge to continue support in the Saudi-led war on Yemen. So Sudan still doesn't have an independent foreign policy. It's still very much seen as a client state. And the reason why it normalized relations with Israel was actually to make way for a more important strategic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Because, of course, it's much easier for Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel if many other Arab regimes have already kind of taken the plunge. And in terms of sorry, what was the first part of your question?
How the structure of the government has changed?
Oh, the structure. So it was a military dictatorship for 30 years, and the military apparatus that was the strongest part of Sudanese society is still in power, and it's still in many people's eyes calling the shots. And if anything, the civilian part of the government has actually done the military a favor because there's this kind of illusion of some sort of sharing of power. That means when there are controversial decisions, such as Sudan normalizing relations with Israel, it's not the military that gets the flak, it's the civilian aspect of the government.
And what are the main priorities of the transitional government at this stage?
It's meant to be a process leading to a democratically elected government. So on kind of they're trying to kind of detangle the military dictatorship that had a strong grip on the country for 30 years, trying to separate the judiciary system from the military and trying to implement some sort of democratic processes so that when elections do take place at the end of the 3 years, that it's free and fair. However, it doesn't seem that that's likely to happen. There was meant to be a legislative council in place by this point. It still isn't there. The free forces for freedom of change are disunited. They're arguing amongst themselves. The Sudanese Communist Party has recently just stepped away from the forces for freedom of change. And one of the things that was interesting that the minister said is when I asked him, will Sudan be able to chart an independent foreign policy? He says that depends on the strength of the civilian part of the government. And at the moment, while the is weak, strong, which means the Saudi and Emirati influence is strong, and it doesn't seem that the forces for freedom of change are going to be uniting anytime soon.
And what of the peace agreement signed within warring factions in the country last month? Do you believe that this suggests there's hope for a more democratic and unified Sudan in the future?
It is definitely a hopeful sign that since Sudan's independence, the periphery regions have been in some sort of conflict with the central government in Khartoum. So any attempt to stop that fighting is important. However, not all of the parties that are fighting signed to the peace agreement, which is worrying. But it is a step in the right direction. But if it is seen that there isn't a true transition to democracy, then it seems that the causes of the conflict, which is underdevelopment and lack of resources for these regions, that will still be there, and the fighting will resume. So a lot kind of banks on this transitional period and whether it does lead to true democracy or if it just leads to symbolic democracy where the military is in the shadows calling the shots.
Where can viewers follow your work, Ahmed, if they're interested in learning more about this and seeing your reports, not only on Sudan, but you've done great reports on Venezuela, also, for example, and of course, in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Ahmed Kaballo, and you can follow the work on presstv.com.
Well, I recommend everybody do that. Follow Ahmed. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Anya, for having me.